So the perspective I want to offer is FDA's perspective and how do patients and patient advocacy groups engage with FDA. I'm going to try to do this fairly quickly. My goal in this talk is really, it's hard to give you all the information you need in the short amount of times. So the slides should be available to you, and my goal was really to provide you with all the links to get additional information so you can sort of follow up on things, and to give you contact information as well, so if you have questions, you know who to reach out to. So by way of background, just to set the stage, and I think most folks here know this, FDA, we have a pretty broad mission. Our mission is to promote and protect the public health, and we do this in a variety of different ways. But the things that all of you care about is sort of get drugs, biologics, and devices for the different rare diseases that impact you or impact your family members and loved ones. And so what's really FDA's role in that process? And I think it's important to sort of start with that, so that really helps guide how and when you engage with the agency. And it's important to understand that FDA's role in this process is really to promote the development of these products and ultimately to review and approve applications that companies submit to us to allow drugs and biologics and devices out on the market. So just to be clear, FDA is primarily not a research institution. So we're not the ones conducting the research. You have companies and others conducting the research, and they submit the applications to FDA for us to review. Okay, so how can patients engage with FDA? And this is just sort of a bulleted list of the different ways in which I'm going to talk about, very practical things. So let's start with the first. The first is patient and patient advocacy groups can and do request meetings with FDA. Individual patient groups, like I said, can and do request meetings with FDA, but it's important to sort of bear in mind, when should you request this meeting? What's the most appropriate way to do so? So I think one of the most important things that patient advocacy groups can do is really just to get educated about the FDA process and to really educate your membership about the process, to really understand what's the role that we have to play. You know, FDA is governed by laws and by regulations, and there are very strict guidelines within which we have to function. And so it's really helpful to sort of understand what are the boundaries that are sort of non-starters for us. These are the boundaries we have to work within. And to understand what those boundaries are, to understand what we need in order to be able to do our job to promote and protect the health. And our primary goal is really to get safe and effective products out on the market. That's it. There's no other agenda here. So there is a lot of good information on FDA's website, and if anyone's ever been on FDA's website, it's a bit of a bear to navigate. So I've given you the main FDA web page as sort of an optimistic hope here, but I've also given you the patient-specific web page, and this web page was really designed by the group in FDA that's really geared to working with patients, and that, I have to admit, that web page is pretty fantastic. And it really is a great place for you to get all the information you need that's really going to be relevant for you as a patient and a patient group. So understand the FDA process and learn about FDA's process. So if you try to get whatever information you can online and you're not getting your answers, if you still have questions about, well, how does the process work? What needs to happen here? That's when patients ask and patient groups ask to meet with us, and we do meet with them. And I'll tell you who to contact in the next slide. So one is, I did what I could to learn about the process and I still have questions. The second is, you know, more and more patient advocacy groups are actually engaged in the conduct of research. For example, a lot of patient groups have registries and they're conducting natural history studies. So when you're engaged in the conduct of research, and if you want to get guidance, that's another time to sort of reach out to the agency. And lastly, occasionally, if there is a specific product that's under review, so there's a company that is developing a product for the disease that you are most interested in, and you want to talk to the agency about that product, that's another time that you can request to meet with the agency. But I want to caveat that, because if the patient group isn't sort of partnered with industry, it's really hard to have sort of a two-way dialogue with the agency about a product under review. There are strict laws and rules that sort of prevent the agency from being able to talk to someone who is not the company, who has that information, to talk about it to someone, to sort of a patient advocacy group. So if you are interested in talking about a product under development, sort of the two ways to go about it is either to partner with industry and perhaps come to the meeting with industry. We've seen that where industry members will bring patient advocacy groups with them during meetings. Or if you're not able to do that, you can still come to the agency to have that meeting. But bear in mind that it's largely going to be a listening meeting from the agency standpoint where we can hear your perspectives, but we may be fairly limited in what we can say. We're not trying to be unhelpful here, we're just limited in what we can say. So those are the three main areas. So who do you contact? And again, this is really intended to be just resources for you. So the first is the Office of Health and Constituent Affairs, OCA. They have a patient liaison team. They're the ones who developed that fantastic patient website that I just mentioned. And they are a great portal for questions about process, questions about, I have no idea where to get started, who do I go to for this? They're a great place. The second is my office, the Office of Orphan Products Development. We run a number of different programs in the office, but because our primary mission is really to work with patients and stakeholders in the rare disease space, we often field a lot of questions from advocacy groups as well. And then because so much of the development and the interest is really on the drug side, I put Center for Drug Evaluation and Research contact information as well. CEDAR has their own rare disease program, which is really focused on the development of drugs within CEDAR. And there's also a professional affairs and stakeholder engagement group. So, if you're not even sure who to contact, the reality is you can call any one of us and we will direct you to the right place. All these groups sort of speak and meet on a regular basis, so we'll make sure that we're coordinating internally. So you can request to meet with FDA, and again, you should do that. Think carefully about when and how you do it, because again, going back to the earlier conversation about resources, there are limited resources. So we do our best to grant meetings, to meet with you, because we want to be available and accessible, but we may be constrained by the resources that we have available. The second way to really engage with FDA is through the FDA Advisory Committee process. What is an advisory committee? It's basically a committee of these are external experts. So they include academicians, researchers, scientists, consumer reps, and patients or caregivers on a committee that will basically provide advice to the agency. And often this happens, for example, when the agency is considering a product that's under review. So say there's a drug that the agency is deciding whether to approve or not to approve. In many cases, the agency will ask an advisory committee, their external experts, to sort of review the data and give us, and to give FDA sort of their best opinion about how they view the data. Patient groups can actually have a representative on that committee. These meetings happen, they're open, there's always an open public session. So I can talk about the different ways you can get involved in the advisory committee process. Look at that, how can you participate in the advisory committee process? The first is, as I mentioned, there's always an open public session as part of the advisory committee process. So even if you're not on the committee, that shouldn't stop you. There will be a notice that's issued about, hey, there's a committee meeting on the review of X drug, and you can either submit written comments or you can request to provide oral comments during the open public session. They try to accommodate as many oral comments as they can, but if they get more requests than they can handle, then it's generally just a lottery system in terms of who gets a chance to speak. So you can write in your comments, you can ask to provide oral comments, or you can actually serve as a patient representative on an advisory committee meeting. And the link for info about advisory committee meetings, the meeting schedule, meeting materials, that link is there. So check out that link. That's another great site that'll tell you, here are the meetings that are going on. So you can sort of plan which ones you might need to participate in. So say you are interested in engaging as a patient representative. What is a patient representative and how do you become one? So a patient representative is actually a representative on the committee itself. It's an application process. You have to go through, you have to apply. You have to go through conflicts of interest, just like any other expert that serves on the panel. And then once you go through that process and you get selected, there's a big training process that happens as well, so you sort of understand what your role is and how best to do it. So this link at the bottom sort of tells you more information about the patient representative program, how you can apply, things to keep in mind. One thing I do want to note, and I say this all the time, if you remember I just said, hey, if you want to be at the table to talk about a specific product, you should really partner with industry to do that. That's how we can engage with you. But I will caveat that when you partner with industry, you also have to be mindful of the fact that if you or someone in your organization wants to be part of the patient representative program, you can't have a conflict of interest. So think about that as you're sort of going through how you want to have these conversations. So we talked about having sort of individual meetings with the agency, participating in the advisory committee process. There are a number of public meetings, workshops, and webinars that FDA puts together that patients really can engage in, and those serve multiple purposes. They are either didactic, where FDA is trying to educate the community about different issues. More often than not, though, it's really because we want to hear from you about your perspectives and your experiences. So one of the big meetings, a series of meetings that have been going on, and you'll hear more about that from the next speaker, is the patient-focused drug development meetings. I just wanted to spend a few minutes to talk about it. There's generally a lot of conversations about it, and I'm happy to talk more afterwards. But the patient-focused drug development meeting was really an initiative that started in 2012, and it was really intended to get patient input about what is most important to them in their disease, what are some of the challenges with their treatments for specific diseases. So what the agency did was they put out a list of diseases, 40% of which were rare diseases, and they've had individual meetings where the patient community sort of comes together to talk about what is most important to them as part of the disease process in terms of what they need for a treatment. And you'll hear more about one particular meeting related to alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So those meetings have been, I've lost track of how many meetings we have. I think it's been about 16 or so we've had. There's probably about another 4 or 5, I believe, don't quote me on the numbers, that we're going to be having. But this is not finite. It was really sort of a learning process for the agency to really understand, how do we get this information from the patient community? Now the agency has put together a way for patient groups to conduct these meetings themselves. And so if you go on the website, you can learn more about how, if you want to conduct a meeting yourself, how you go about doing that. So I just listed some of these public meetings that are happening. I wanted to note one, this isn't one of the patient-focused meetings. The March 31st, that might be one that folks might be interested in. It's just a public workshop on how to navigate Center for Drug Evaluation and Research for advocacy groups. That seems right up your alley. So this might be a good workshop for folks to consider. And if you look, the March 16th is an example of a patient-focused drug development meeting. It's not for a rare disease, it's for psoriasis, but just to give you a sense of what's going on. So more information about how you learn about these meetings is down there below. So we talked about individual meetings, advisory committees, public workshops, webinars. The other way you can really provide input is through providing comments through the proposed rule, through the rulemaking process, and through the guidance development process. I will tell you this. I know it will often feel like you're sending your opinion off into a black hole. Let me assure you that that is not what happens. As an office that has issued rules and guidances, we read every comment that we get, and we consider every comment that we get. We may not adopt it, and if we decide not to adopt it, we have reasons. We have to have specific reasons for why we're not adopting it. So I want folks to understand that this is another robust way for you to provide input. So FDA publishes proposed rules and guidance documents on a variety of different issues. So for a rule, there's a specified comment period. So I issue a proposed rule on orphan drug regulations, say, and we did that a few years ago. You'll have either 60 days or 90 days to provide comments, and those comments will be considered before issuing a final rule. So that's the rulemaking process. We also issue guidances. Guidances don't have the force and effect of law. They're really sort of our best suggestions, our best recommendations for how things should be done from FDA's perspective. Those also have a comment period, but the truth is you can submit comments to a guidance at any point. If you want your comments to be considered for a draft guidance, I highly encourage you to submit your comments before the end of the comment period, because then you can ensure that they'll really get taken into consideration when drafting the final. I know I'm racing through a whole lot of this stuff, so I'm happy to answer questions. I'll be here a little bit afterwards to take more questions. So again, this sort of runs through what I talked about, the difference between a proposed rule and a guidance. And how do I know when proposed rules or guidances are issued for which I can comment on? How do I know? You guys issue so much stuff. Where do I find this information? And so I have a couple of links here. And lastly, as I mentioned, patient groups are increasingly engaged in research. And I started off saying, FDA doesn't conduct research. As a general matter, there are some exceptions. We don't conduct research. We're also not a huge funding agency. NIH is really, their primary focus is research and funding. But we do have certain funds that we've been privileged to provide grants for, particularly in the rare disease space. And I'm very pleased that this year we were able to sort of allocate about $2 million to funding natural history studies. So it's a program that we're very excited about. One of the things we heard over and over again from groups interested in doing natural history studies or conducting natural history studies is how hard it is to actually do them and how hard it is to get funding to do them. So we're hoping to help alleviate some of this burden. I mean, it's not a huge program, but anything to move the needle forward is a step in the right direction. So I've listed the dates for when the deadlines are. So if your group is conducting a natural history study or interested in conducting a natural history study, you should consider this program. And if you want to learn more about natural history studies, we did a really nice a video discussion actually featuring perspectives from patients, including, for example, the alpha-1 antitrypsin community, Prader-Willi, and VHL, to really talk about what is a natural history study, why is it important, and sort of some real practical things to think about when you're doing it. So that video link is here as well.